Welcome to the deep dive. We often grapple with these really fundamental questions. What truly defines us?
Yeah, is it our heritage, our experiences, or maybe just how society sees us?
It,
It's a lot.
it is. And today we're taking a deep dive into that incredibly complex and, let's be honest, often uncomfortable territory of race, identity, and culture.
Absolutely. And that includes some really thought-provoking stuff like this evolving idea of transracial identity, and also something that for many is surprisingly hard to grasp, white culture.
Right. So, our mission today is basically to cut through all the noise. We've gathered insights from, well, all over the place academic papers, sure, but also YouTube videos, Reddit threads, personal stories.
Real mix.
Exactly. We're trying to pull out the most important bits, the key insights, the surprising facts, so you can walk away feeling genuinely well informed, but not, completely buried in information.
Yeah, makes sense of it all.
Okay, so let's unpack this.
Well, when most of us first think about race, the gut feeling, the sort of intuitive idea, is that it's fixed, biological.
Totally. Something you inherit, it's in your
Yeah.
genes.
Yeah,
That's definitely how I grew up thinking about it.
me too. But the sources we looked at show this really significant shift in the scientific world.
Okay, so what was the big evidence? What really flipped that common understanding and showed race is primarily, well, a social thing, not biological.
A massive turning point was the Human Genome Project. I mean, the evidence was pretty undeniable. It showed that the genetic differences between the groups we call races, they're actually much smaller than the variations within those same groups.
So, wait, more difference within a group than between two different groups?
Exactly. We're talking about humans being like one of the most genetically similar species out there.
Wow. So those physical things we link to race, skin color, hair texture, whatever, they don't just stop at a border, it's more gradual.
Precisely. Think of it like a gradient, or what scientists call a cline. Like how temperature changes gradually as you travel, it blends. There aren't these neat, sharp boxes for race.
Okay, that makes sense.
And if you look at other genetic markers, like, say, ABO blood types, the groupings can look totally different from racial lines. Europeans and Africans might be closer in blood type genetics than either group is to Chinese populations, for instance.
So it really shows how superficial those visible differences are. They don't map neatly onto deep biological divides.
Not at all.
That's fascinating because if race isn't mainly biological, then, well, how did we even come up with these categories, these often really rigid boxes?
Yeah, that's the key question. The sources show the modern idea of race is actually pretty recent. It didn't really take hold in European thinking until after the Renaissance, like 17th century onwards.
So people like Linnaeus, Blumenbach, back in the 1700s, they started classifying people based on things like skull shape.
Right, often pretty arbitrary traits. But here's the really insidious part our sources highlight. Even after that pseudoscience was discredited, it didn't just vanish.
It stuck around.
Yeah, it sort of mutated, got embedded deep into society. Our laws, institutions, even just our default thinking. It created these systemic issues that are still around today, way beyond what those early classifiers probably intended.
So things like scientific racism, justifying awful stuff like slavery.
Exactly. That false idea of polygenism, different races from different origins, like different species,
Yeah.
horrifying stuff. And even after World War II, when Nazi ideology totally discredited that kind of thinking,
It still lingered.
it got, like you said, baked into the systems.
Which brings us to how race works socially, right? The rules society makes up.
Totally. Look at Brazil. Their system is much more fluid based on appearance.
Yeah.
Then you contrast that with the U.S. one-drop rule. Historically, just one black ancestor meant you were classified as black. Super rigid.
So, okay, race isn't some deep biological truth, but it is a massive social reality. It has real objective consequences.
Absolutely. You see it in health outcomes, the justice system, even how forensic scientists might assign race to remains, which is really just predicting how society would have categorized that person.
It's a powerful example of how ideas shape reality.
It really is. It's compelling, isn't it? How a few visible traits became the foundation for these huge, powerful social categories. And then those categories just took on a life of their own.
Okay, so if we accept race is largely social, built on ideas more than biology, that really changes how we think about identity. And it leads straight to the next big question. What about culture? What even is culture in all this?
Great question. Because, yeah, it's huge. Edward Tyler's definition is classic. The complex whole of human knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom. It's just everything a group shares.
And historically, sometimes culture was used in, well, pretty problematic ways, right? Contrasted with anarchy or the state of nature.
Sadly, yes. That led to those awful civilized versus uncivilized ideas used to justify racism, colonialism. But it's so important to remember culture isn't static. It's dynamic, always changing, influenced by groups mixing and interacting.
That helps clarify the difference between ethnicity and race, then. Ethnicity is more about shared experience, family history, traditions.
Exactly. It's constructed through social interaction. That's the constructivist idea. It's not some ancient, unchanging, primordial thing. That distinction is key, seeing identity as fluid, not fixed.
So, like, Italian-American traditions or specific German heritage, that's ethnicity, a cultural lineage within a broader racial group. Okay, that distinction feels really important as we get to this next idea, which for a lot of people, especially in the US, feels almost invisible: white culture.
Right. And for many people, particularly white people, white culture often feels, well, ephemeral, intangible, complex, as one source put it. Hard to see.
Like the air we breathe.
Yeah, just the default. Often invisible if you're inside it because it's just everywhere.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because even if it's invisible, understanding white culture is actually super important. Our sources really hit this hard, especially in workplaces, in organizations.
Judith H. Katz made this point, that many organizations have assumptions, values, and beliefs based on white culture deeply embedded in their policies, practices, and styles for success.
Embedded how? Like, what are the examples?
Well, you see it woven in everywhere. Preferred ways of speaking, what counts as professional behavior, dress codes, writing styles, even the art on the walls. Think about, historically, the golf course, often a space pretty much closed off to anyone but white men for a long time. Or even how benefit programs often reflect that sort of idealized white nuclear family.
Wow, okay. Those are subtle but, yeah, pervasive examples of these norms setting the standard.
Exactly, but defining it, that's tricky. People in workshops really struggle to separate white culture from just, general American culture or capitalism, or even just what they see in movies.
And the sources suggested another layer. Something about shame.
Yeah, that was fascinating. For many white participants, the weight of historical racism, maybe some shame tied to that, seemed to make it really hard to look objectively at a broader white culture. It was easier to focus on differences within whiteness, like being Italian-American or German-American, than to generalize.
But eventually, they did identify some common dimensions after getting past the denial and confusion.
They did, and they generated a fairly consistent listing of dimensions. And this revealed something powerful.
Which was?
That white culture is the lens through which many white people view, evaluate, and judge themselves and others regarding what is professional and normal behavior in many contexts.
Okay, so it acts like an invisible standard.
Which creates a kind of cultural advantage for white people. One source even called it affirmative action for whites, basically tilting the playing field without anyone naming it.
So the idea is to make that bias visible, expose it.
Exactly. Make it visible and acknowledged and known. The point isn't to bash white culture, but to see it clearly. Use its aspects when they genuinely add value for everyone, but not when they accidentally shut out other perspectives or reinforce biases.
Right, not let it be the only acceptable way.
Ultimately, it's about understanding white culture as just one of many cultures, one set of values, attitudes, and behaviors among many. It needs to be seen as a culture, not the culture.
Making it visible helps level that playing field. Got it. That's a really crucial shift. Okay, now let's pivot to another really complex, often very controversial idea: transracial identity.
Yeah, this one generates a lot of heat.
So the basic idea is identifying as a different race than the one you were assigned at birth. And it's important, the sources say, this isn't just liking aspects of a culture.
Right, it's described by some as a much deeper thing, a deep sense of belonging to a different racial group.
Now, historically, transracial meant something else, right? Like in adoption.
Exactly. Interracial adoption. A black child adopted by a white family, for instance. That was the common usage. This newer meaning about self-identifying your race, that's what sparks a lot of suspicion and pretty strong resistance.
Why? What are the motivations people describe?
Sources point to a few things. A desire to match how you look on the outside with how you feel on the inside. Sometimes it stems from personal trauma or societal pressure, maybe even a genuine, if perhaps misguided, fascination with another culture.
We saw examples, right, like that Reddit user finding acceptance through a Japanese aesthetic after being bullied, or this idea of racial dysphoria.
Yeah, that concept of distress from a mismatch between your assigned race and how you feel internally is complicated territory.
Which leads to comparisons with transgender identity, doesn't it?
It does. That's a really common comparison. If we accept transgender identities, why not transracial ones? Both seem to involve an internal sense of self clashing with an assigned category.
And people point to gender dysphoria and the steps people take, like therapy or surgery, to align their physical self with their internal identity.
But it raises a tough question. Why does one identity shift seem more legitimate or understandable to many people, while the other faces such strong pushback?
So what are the key differences people point out?
Well, Simon Cushing brings up the idea of intergenerational oppression. He argues racial oppression is unique because it carries this shared history of injustice across generations. Think about Canadian residential schools or debates about reparations.
Right. So the question becomes, can someone who hasn't lived that history genuinely claim membership in that group's racial experience?
That's the core of that critique. Others argue gender does have some biological component, making the comparison imperfect since we've established race is largely social.
Plus, there aren't really accepted pathways for racial transition like there are for gender transition.
Exactly. No established medical or social procedures. And sources also note that race is often a much more closely policed category than gender, tied up with civil rights, historical struggles. It's not seen as easily changeable.
And we've definitely seen controversies flare up around specific individuals. Rachel Dolezal is probably the most famous.
Right. And Oli London wanting to look like a K-pop star, Martina Biggs' extreme modifications, Shaq King being criticized. These cases highlight the friction.
They really do.
And if you connect it back, these controversies aren't just isolated incidents. They really show how deep our ideas about colorism run. That discrimination within a racial group based on skin tone.
Like the historical brown paper bag clubs you mentioned.
Exactly. Those internal hierarchies powerfully shape how self-identification gets perceived and whether it gets accepted.
There's also the white privilege argument, isn't there?
Yeah, that comes up a lot. Critics argue that when a white person identifies as a member of a historically oppressed race, it can feel like an exercise of white privilege.
Because they could theoretically go back to being white and accessing those privileges, something unavailable to people born into that oppression.
That's the argument. Now, one philosophical paper noted you could make similar points about privilege in some transgender transitions, but the core concern here is that transracialism might seem to minimize the very real impact of race and racism.
Turning it into a choice, something you can pick up or discard.
Right. That quote from Jod Armour was powerful. Michael Brown couldn't be transracial. Those black bodies had no choice in how they were perceived. It just highlights that brutal reality of race often being imposed on people.
And what about concerns from marginalized communities themselves and transracial adoptees?
They often feel their own complex identities are being erased or diminished. The idea that someone can just opt into a racial experience they haven't lived feels invalidating, like a betrayal even.
So focusing just on individual choice ignores the bigger picture, the history, the social reality.
That's the worry, that it overlooks the systemic nature of race and the struggles people face because of it.
And now, technology is throwing another wrench into the work.
Oh, absolutely. Genome editing, things like TALENs, mage the potential to physically alter traits linked to race. That's on the horizon.
So what happens then? If you can physically change to match an internal racial identity, does that make it more acceptable? Or does it just open a whole new can of ethical worms?
Huge questions. And what about access? Who gets this technology? Plus, you have virtual reality, augmented reality, creating digital avatars that reflect any race you want.
Blurring the lines even further between physical and virtual selves.
Definitely. And it's also important here to touch on the minority effect. Just because a group is a statistical global minority, like white people being around 11% globally, doesn't automatically mean they lack power or are socially vulnerable. That link isn't automatic.
Right. And we absolutely have to flag dangerous misinterpretations here, things like the white genocide or great replacement conspiracy theories.
Utterly false. Deeply racist narratives used to push white supremacy. They twist these complex identity discussions into something really harmful. We have to be clear about that.
Absolutely. So given all this complexity, this messiness, what's the path forward?
Well, the consensus from the sources seems to be about leaning into respectful communication, empathy, critical thinking. being willing to really listen to different viewpoints, even uncomfortable ones.
Accepting that identity is just like messy, fluid.
Yeah, embracing that, seeing it more like a spectrum, less like rigid boxes.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
We have covered a lot of ground today.
We really have.
From taking apart the idea of race as purely biological, exploring white culture as this powerful, often unseen force, then diving headfirst into transracial identity, the controversies, the ethics.
And how technology might change everything all over again.
It's clear there are no easy answers here, definitely no black and white solutions.
Not at all. This whole conversation really forces you to confront some pretty uncomfortable truths, doesn't it? About ourselves, identity, society.
It really does. So maybe the final thought for everyone listening is this. Given everything we've talked about, race, identity, the tech advancements, how will our definitions keep shifting? What ethical guardrails do we actually need? And that future possibility, if tech lets people physically change race, would that make transracial identity more accepted, less?
Okay.
Or just create a whole new wave of questions we haven't even thought of yet?
Oof, that's a big one to chew on.
It is.
It just shows this conversation is alive. It's constantly evolving.
So we really encourage you to keep exploring, keep asking questions, and yeah, keep the conversation going, but do it with curiosity and with compassion.